Okay, there we go. So, I heard a lot of themes and what people were sharing about just sort of the unconscious aspects of racism that happens, especially for, those of us who have some degree of comfort. And so those of us who have comfort, even if we have the complexity of what it means to be white, there's this comfort of white skin privilege that we have in our societies. And then so many of us have been talking about, as Buddhist practitioners, that we bring this desire of being, good people, of living an ethical life, of having integrity, and, creating a world of non-harming. And so one of the things that I really think that it's important for us to look at the complexity of our worlds and to not try to simplify it, and to really hold on to that basis of integrity within all of these causes and conditions that arise. Tanisara, who many of you know is a Dharma teacher, speaks to this importance of upholding sila, integrity, and all of this. And she uses the term ethic. An inner ethic maintains values that are deeply resonant with interconnectedness of everything, an appreciation of causality, and a sense of care for the whole web of life. An inner ethic needs to be guided by wise reflection, enabling the negotiation of complexity, including the many gray areas of daily life. I find that she just wraps in this quote so much, this sense of like we have this inner ethic which we're really clear about, but then we're in this web of life that has so many of these conditions of causality over time. And then recognize the complexity of the gray areas of how we meet our daily life. And then how we show up. So when we think of this term causality, that in this causes that, and in Buddhism it's not a direct causality that the Buddha teaches, there's many myriad causes and conditions. And so the impacts of the legacies of racial conditioning, have been taught to us, or one of those areas of causality, of conditioning. And so the term in Buddhism, when we look at conditioning, is this term which people use oftentimes, dependent origination or interdependent co-arising, which is a lot longer to say. But dependent origination or interdependent co-arising refers to this understanding that everything is interconnected, that nothing is arising independent of conditions. And so for us, in a very individualistic culture, we sometimes can forget that, because it's just about, I'm doing this, but I'm doing this based on my own histories of the people, my own family, culture, society. There's all of these pieces. And so we can think of dependent origination of being a very small act of like, I am doing this. If I steal something, I might get caught, and have some attending punishment, if you will. Or we can think of it on different scales. And so when we think about dependent origination, these connections, we can see ourselves as part of this system. And so that everything that's happening around us, we are impacted by, and in turn impacting. So it's not like we're just a pinball being kind of hit back and forth. We are impacting, and we're impacted by it. And we can be impacted inwardly and outwardly, and we can both impact both ways. Christina Feldman, who is a Dharma meditation teacher, one people who started Gaia House, says about dependent origination. She says it's also helpful, I think, to see this process of dependent origination that happens not only within our individual consciousness, but also on a much bigger scale and on more collective levels, social, political, cultural. Through shared opinions, shared views, shared perceptions or reactions, groups or communities of people can spin the same wheel over extended periods of time. And then she says, examples of collective wheel spinning are racism or sexism or the hierarchy between humans and nature, political systems, the whole thing where communities or groups of people share in the same delusion. So she calls this wheel spinning of dependent origination at the collective level, that we're caught in this, spinning that we're a part of. It's this delusion. And so she says, so understanding dependent origination can be transforming not only at an individual level, but it's an understanding about interconnectedness that can be truly transforming on a global or universal level. It helps to undo delusion and helps to undo the self-contractedness and sense of separateness. So I find that this is useful for me, like as we understand this dependent origination, this sense of the systems, that we can transform our understanding that, from this idea of that the systems are operating out there and they're operating internally, and we can begin to be aware of them. And so one of the forces that the Buddha speaks to that moves us towards suffering is this force of ignorance or delusion. And being ignorant of these systems is partly what Christina Fellman is talking about here. That then, ends up with this place of contraction and the delusion of separateness. And so we can practice. That's the thing that the Buddha has given us instructions to practice with these forces of delusion or greed or aversion. And one of the basic practices is mindfulness. And so we can use mindfulness to awaken ourselves to what's happening, so that we know when we're, that foggy mind, the clouded mind, the ignorance is not clear, or the craving mind, or the aversion. And oftentimes we just think about it of like, the level of like cookies or jobs, but we can apply it as well to these systems. Ruth King calls racism a heart disease. And so when we think about this system of racism as a heart disease, she says that how we think and respond is at the core of racial suffering and racial healing. If we cannot think clearly and respond wisely, we will continue to damage the world's heart. And then she calls mindfulness heart surgery. So that we have this heart disease that's impacting all of us, as somebody was talking about bystanders being impacted, like that we're all impacted in this interconnected system. And our mindfulness is like the heart surgery that we use to pay attention to what's arising internally and what's arising externally. And bringing in that curiosity, bringing in that sense of investigation, so that we can interrupt those habitual responses and get into the somatic experiences in the body. So I wanted to talk about kind of sort of one of the things that derails us sometimes for this is in our practice. Some of the ways that we use mindfulness is to get to a place to feel resourced. And sometimes we can then conflate this sense of calm or balance with kind of where we want to go to, that's what we want to attend to. And the Buddha actually was really clear that the sukha, or the pleasant, will be beneficial for us, but that's not liberation, that will resource us and allow us to engage, but that's not like the final liberation. And some of us can then conflate that with liberation. And so when we're working with ignorance and working with delusion, one of the things that we can begin to realize is that when we feel that sense of calmness or whatever, that can also be like, oh, right, this is real. I can resource myself here, but I don't want to just land here and just sort of stay kind of like if you were thinking about the airport and that holding pattern of like, I'm not really going to land right now. And this is from Dr. Camila Majid, who's a professor and a teacher of mindfulness. And this was an article in Lion's Roar, where she says, the yearning for calm is as natural as fear of new experiences. Yet we know that aversion to change and attachment to calm just leads to more suffering. So isn't that interesting that this calm, that like calm is just like we want calm. Obviously, it's like the waves are going like this. Surfers, you want the waves, but then you want to ride them, and then the attachment to calm leads to more suffering. And so she talks about the place to begin is to do one's daily practice with curiosity about uncomfortable feelings, thoughts, and sensations that arise when considering anti-Black racism in one's interior life, interactions, and environs. Is the discomfort that arises connected to attachment to privilege, to not wanting to give up more time or energy to thinking about anti-Black racism? Does contemplating it cause a sense of overwhelm or guilt or shame about privilege? And so we can then begin to see these habit patterns that arise, that sort of this complacency. And so this aversion is then what comes in, this aversion to disrupting my little bit of calm, or like, oh, I've got a little bit of sanity right now, or whatever you want to, whatever the word, or balance or peace. And if I bring in this attention to more difficult or the complexities of the systems, I'm going to lose that too. But the Buddha teaches us that there's a greater freedom than this just little piece of calm, and that we can actually resource ourselves with that calm. And in addition to that, we can also cultivate non-hatred, kindness, compassion. So as we're like, oh, I really need some calm, we can bring in that compassion for ourselves and be like, yeah, we sure do. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We can't go outside. They're going to shut down things even more. People are getting, all of these things, so that we can then bring in compassion. So it's not like that we don't have real situations that we're attending to. And we can also recognize the limits of our abilities to act right now. And there's just so much that we don't know. So when we don't know what we don't know, that's the ignorance, right? We don't know what we don't know. But with our mindfulness practice, we can begin to attend somatically to what's happening in our bodies and in our environments. You know how like when you walk into a room and you can feel the energy in the room and you think, well, something's going on here, but I don't really know what. And so that ability to pause and to check in with the body, and then to be curious and investigate. And so this investigation can help us with these habitual tendencies that just perpetuate this white privilege, or what's often called white supremacy. I really like this definition by Michael Eric Dyson, who's a preacher, academic, author. You may have seen them. He's often on different talk shows, written a number of books. And he says, white supremacy is the conscious or unconscious belief or the investment in the inherent superiority of some, while others are believed to be innately inferior. And it doesn't demand the individual participation of the singular bigot. It is a machine operating in perpetuity because it doesn't demand that somebody be in place driving. And so he talks about this being conscious and unconscious. And so some of these things that are happening are unconscious and we won't know, but we can begin to bring them into consciousness. And so that we can see the systems, if you will, that are work, the machinations that, are maintaining the status quo that creates a hierarchy that privileges some people and not others. And the key thing here is it doesn't demand individual participation. And that to me is one of the places where it's really important that in our Buddhist practice, we don't get stuck in that calm and peacefulness, because that could just be the status quo. And the status quo, if we look around at our society, means that the people in power are mostly white. The people who own corporations are mostly white. The people who teach in schools are mostly white. The people, on and on and on. So we have to have that little bit of attention to the somatic experience so that we can note when we feel something just a little bit off, because the machinations that are happening are this delusion that continues, that's really hard to wake up to. And so our Buddhist practices can really support this system of making things conscious, that we have the capacity to interrupt and to train our hearts and minds, and that we've been practicing how to do this. Resmaa Menakem, many of you may know, wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago called My Grandmother's Hands. Talks a lot about, he's a psychologist, talks a lot about the somaticization of trauma. And he says, he's very direct, it's not that we've been lazy or insecure, but we've focused our efforts in the wrong directions. We tried to teach our brains to think better about race, but the white body supremacy does not live in our thinking brains. And so he uses the term white body supremacy. And he says our bodies have a form of knowledge that is different from our cognitive brains. This knowledge is typically experienced as a felt sense of constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. Often this knowledge is stored in our bodies as wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. If we are to upend white body supremacy, we must begin with our bodies. And so I find this to be so true that a lot of times when we start this work, we learn a lot, analytically up here. We learn these stories. We, saw the video. Probably none of that was new to us. There was legacies of slavery and lynching and separate but equal. And sometimes that just lives here. And this disconnect from the heart, this Ruth King talks about, the heart disease, and then the body that's been experiencing what it means to be shut down and cut off from the interconnectedness. And so this mindfulness that we practice, mindfulness based in the body, is such a support for disrupting the delusions of separateness, the delusions that it's okay. The sense of, oh, if we just fix a few little things over here, kind of change the drapes or the, color of the whatever, but really it's this, just like the Buddhist practice is a liberatory practice where we're transforming. So bringing our awareness into the body and into this felt sense during our meditation periods can really help, because we can practice with the simpler part of what is happening in the body when we're meditating, and then we can bring that into our relations, with one or more people. And then we can begin to identify. And I don't know about you, but sometimes, I'm just able to, like, something happens and I'm just feel a little off, and it's not till later that I'm actually able to reflect on what that was. And then later it's like, oh, and the beginning to see the habit patterns, the tendencies of this heart and mind, that are in that the forces of greed or the forces of hatred or the forces of ignorance come in and manifest based on the habit tendencies of this body, heart, mind, not just the culture, but my families, the schooling and the media and all of these things, they intersect in this moment. And then here I am trying to take wise action. Whew, it's a lot. But I really believe in this transformation process. So it's not easy. But if we really want to live in this interconnected society, it's so necessary. And part of what I think gets in the way with these forces is like one of the forces of wanting it to be different, but wondering how to engage and then sort of just staying in that gray area. Tarbrock, a few years ago, wrote an article. Tarbrock, many of you know, is a meditation teacher, lives in the Washington, D.C. area. And she says, one of the things I've noticed when the subject of racism comes up is how white Buddhist practitioners will say, oh yes, this is important, without a feeling that it really involves them, their life, or their spiritual path. And yet you can't be a part of a population where there's been deep trauma and not be involved. We're all involved. Slavery in its formal expression may no longer exist in the United States, but there are new strains that we can see in the disparity of access to a host of resources in education, housing, and jobs. And this sense of having just enough to be able to not see, and depending on where we live and who we involved in, our communities, we might not notice it. And so for some of us, it really does take a stepping outside of our comfort zone of like who is in our communities. And the racial wealth gap in the United States, Black people have 1/16 of the wealth of white folks. And so that means for the net worth of every $100 held by a white family, Black families have $5. And so currently, in our current climate, when we think about the pandemic and rising unemployment, you could see then the impacts, the systemic impacts of what that then goes forth when we have this inequity in wealth distribution, which is a result of one of the legacies of slavery and other ways that have been policies of redlining and other ways that people of color have been prevented from gaining wealth and passing wealth along to their families. And so this is where we can get delusion and aversion and greed kind of all working together. So what does it mean? So then we can become like, what does it mean for me then to show up, and can I experience the society in a way where I can fully show up, acknowledging my privilege, acknowledging what is right action for me. Some of us may have more wealth than others. So is it generosity or is it reparations? Where does our wealth come from? We might just think about, oh, I'm being generous. But is it actually making amends? So these are questions that we can bring into our mindfulness practice to see, like, what does it mean for us to practice with the forces that are at play? So as we practice, we can come back to this inner ethic that Tanisar was talking about, this integrity that we're trying to maintain with our practice, with our mindfulness, and realize the complexity and the gray areas that we run into our daily lives. And so we might take some time to reflect outside of these engagements to see how is it that I want to live, and then really understand that sometimes it's going to mean that I have the resources, the calm, the stability to be able to fully engage now. And sometimes it may be that time where I need to investigate this internally. So there's that dynamic between the internal and the external in our actions. And that's what the Buddha speaks to when we're talking about mindfulness. Mindfully internally, mindfully externally, and mindfully both internally and externally when we're looking at the foundations of mindfulness. So our practice is really one that we bring wherever we are. And because as white people in this country and the communities that we're in, this is an element that we can bring our wise reflection to. And I'm so glad to be able to share some of my reflections with you today. And so thank you for your attention.